All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 2018-2019 Connect series. My name is Brandon Clark. I'm a doctoral student in the Educational Leadership Organization and Policy Program in the School of Education at Iowa State University. And I have an echo in the background. I serve on the Division A Graduate Student Committee as co-chair and a host of the Connect series. Kanisha. And our co-host is Kanisha Harrington, who's at Clemson. And we may have some technical difficulties, but that's all right. We'll keep rolling ahead. So the Connect series is an initiative sponsored by the ARA Division A Graduate Student Committee. It features a sequence of virtual real-time sessions broadcast monthly during the academic year. Each session features different scholar, practitioner, panelists, and focus on a unique theme related to educational leadership, organizations, and policy. For today's series, the theme is critical quantitative research perspective. So much of our conversation is going to address some of the following questions. So for one, what is critical quantitative research? How does critical quantitative research compare to critical qualitative research? What advantages and challenges do critical quantitative research perspectives afford educational leadership scholars and practitioners? And then lastly, what understandings are necessary for those who might be interested in engaging critical quantitative research? And Kanisha is now back. So Kanisha, I just introduced the session, but if you'd like to say a few words about yourself, and then Dr. Tabron can go ahead and speak about her.
Perfect. Yes, I'm Kanisha Harrington, co-chair of the Division A Graduate Student Connect series. And I am a graduate student at Clemson University studying educational leadership, and I am a second year.
Thank you. So Dr. Tabron is an assistant professor in the Department of Educational Leadership and Policy Studies at the University of Denver. So we are so fortunate to have her on and hear her perspective about critical quantitative research. Dr. Tabron, can you tell us about yourself, your scholarly interests, and some of your past and current work?
Sure. Well, first of all, I just wanted to say thank you, Brandon and Kanisha, for organizing this series and this conversation, and to the entire Graduate Student Council. Thank you very much for having me. In my research, I study how systemic racism is perpetuated in policy, politics, and statistical data. More specifically, I look at equity and access, issues of equity and access across the PK-20 pipeline. And my interest is in issues of equity and access for African-American youth, especially in their pursuit to college and college access. Some of my current research projects. One project that I'm currently working on is dealing with state policy in Texas and their ban of affirmative action in college admissions. And they're adopting a state automatic admission percent plan policy. So I'm really interested in how essentially a espoused colorblind policy is addressing a racial post-secondary participation gap. A second area of research that I'm currently conducting is based in Colorado, and I'm working with a high school dealing with issues of equity and access in math for underrepresented groups. And this school has identified that math is a gatekeeper for a lot of their students and is keeping them from graduating. And we're looking at the detracking that particular high school. So that's been really interesting for me too. And then finally, I'm looking at school choice policy. And so that's come in as I'm a mom of two girls. I just recently had another girl who's 7 months, but my 5-year-old is now going into, she'll be entering first grade next year. And so in Colorado, they have school choice. So you put in an application and you rank your schools and you go on tours and you have to decide what school, you have to put your bid in for what school you want your child to enroll in. And you hope that they have openings and that they accept you. And so as I was going through these tours through a critical lens, I'm like, okay, some things were uncovering themselves, and it just really made me interested in how principals and families are responding to competition, and how is that related to equity and access. So those are 3 buckets, all dealing with policy at different levels, and related to equity and access for underrepresented groups.
Thank you so much. It sounds like you have a very rich and kind of diverse but interrelated research agenda. We're going to go ahead and just move kind of into the questions on critical quantitative research. And our first question is, what is critical quantitative research? And maybe even before you're giving your understanding of that, can you maybe talk to just a little bit how you got into doing or wanting to be a critical quantitative researcher, or having that perspective at least, and then maybe transition into what is it?
Sure. So I just want to first start off by saying that this is just my perspective and my current thinking about critical quantitative research. And I'm sure others who are viewing or engaged in this conversation may agree with me or disagree with me, but it's just my perspective. And I'm really interested in continuing the conversation. So my journey to critical quant actually came about from racist experiences in K-12 and higher education. So one experience in K-12 occurred. So let me back up. So I was born in Chicago in the Inglewood neighborhood. That's the south side of Chicago. The public school system was not very, very good. And so my parents wanted to move me to a school that they thought would better prepare me. But unfortunately, this school was in jeopardy of state takeover. It was a high poverty school, and I experienced a lot of racism very early on. So although I started school a grade level ahead in reading and math, I had a very racist experience. So I had an interaction with a young lady who called me the N-word, and I responded verbally to that, but the discipline was very different. Her discipline was that she got a phone call home to parents, and it was essentially a tap on the hand. My consequence was that I was removed from advanced reading and math and had to I can no longer participate in those advanced math. And so from that point, I always thought like, okay, this is something that could be taken away from me. I have to prove that I belong. I have to prove that I'm worthy of this education and that I am good essentially at math and reading. And so I carried this through K-12, this weight. And I really believe that that's when this imposter syndrome began to develop. And then in higher ed, so I fast forward, I was beginning my PhD program, and when you begin your PhD programs, many times you don't know what your topic is going to be. For me, I just knew that I wanted to do something that was about equity and disrupting the status quo. But I did notice that there was a division across racial lines of the methodologies and the methods that we wanted to use. And so I noticed that mostly my colleagues of color were geared towards qualitative, and a lot of my white colleagues, although not all, were more geared towards quantitative research. For me, I was determined, just fueled from my K-12 experience of, I'm going to continue to take quantitative courses. So the most diversity I saw in quantitative courses in higher ed was in the mandatory intro statistics course. But from there, it became a more isolating process. And I remember in one of my advanced statistics course, I went to office hours to get clarification on a lecture. And I don't know what led to that, this statement that the professor made to me in that office hours, but she said, you know, I think that African Americans and Latinos should just stick with the arts because they're not good at math. And then she said, please don't think that I'm racist. That's just what the statistics show. And so just think about for a moment, you are a student in that class, and this is how your professor who's teaching a method views you as someone that is not good at the subject matter that they're in your class engaging in. And so for me, that just really fueled my passion to really want to know more about quantitative research and really have a seat at the table to change the narrative and to change the experiences of leaders of color in this class, in those taking those methods classes. And so that's sort of my journey and experience towards critical quantitative research. And so then you asked me, well, what is critical quantitative research? So those experiences are not far from the history of statistics. So historically, statistical research was created as a tool of oppression, attempting to prove the intellectual and cultural inferiority of communities of color. And it was intended to obscure the reality of racism. So you think about the bell curve and you think about IQ testing. All of that is rooted in eugenics. And so for those of you who may be unfamiliar, eugenics is a set of beliefs and practices aimed at improving the genetic quality of human population by saying, here's the good genes, here's not good genetics, and how do we have more superior breeding? How do we have the more ideal population? And so this was created and coined by Francis Galton. Sir Francis Galton, born February 16th, 1822, and he's considered the father of social statistics. He thought statistics was the perfect tool to prove good genetics for ideal breeding. He is the person who created the concept of correlation and the widely promoted regression towards the mean. This is the historical start of statistical research. He was the first to apply statistical methods to the study of human difference and inheritance of intelligence. And so I don't know if you all can see this, but this book, Thicker Than Blood by Tukufu Zuberi, he has a chapter in there about eugenics and the origins of statistics that I encourage you to read. That it's read chapter 3, it's eugenics and the birth of racial statistics. And so scientific racism is the foundation of the American educational system, and it contextualizes many of the contemporary issues of race and social stratification today. So too often communities of color are over-researched, we're exploited for capital gains and scientific advancement. So why do we even have the IRB and informed consent? You have to think about the unethical Tuskegee syphilis study. And we're often dehumanized as a statistic. So it's no secret, and it's not hard to understand why there's a widely held belief that quantitative methods are antithetical to social justice. But I say that situates the problem with the methods instead of the users of the methods. And so for me, critical quantitative inquiry requires that we, as producers and consumers of research, disrupt and push for the reimagining of ways to engage in more culturally inclusive approaches to quantitative inquiry that drives us to critically interrogate and self-appraise our beliefs, probe our research designs, and humanize the data. And we need to approach understanding the story behind the data with curiosity and humility. So critical quantitative inquiry is about the judicious and socially conscious use of quantitative methods in our research. Researchers engaged in this work, they're going to be concerned about the research questions that they're asking, decolonizing research designs, and interpretations that reproduce oppression and maintain the status quo. They're going to be concerned with the variables they're choosing. They're not going to detach their data from the social and historical context. That's how I translate critical quantitative research in my own work. It's using data to resist oppression, to expose discrimination, disrupt systemic racism and white supremacy, while trying my best not to perpetuate it myself.
Wow, that's just, I mean, it's pretty incredible when you think, I mean, the normalization, right, or the naturalness of like how natural it is to see racism, right, or thinking of it being a natural outcome, right, and not a statistically, or race being statistically produced, right, or isms being statistically produced. I think that's something too. And you also mentioned, you know, the problem is with not with so much with, we put the problem on the methods rather than on the users of those methods and kind of their underlying. So much so, for me, it sounds there's a lot of, has to do with a lot of like positionality and who people are and how they're approaching research. And again, that not having perhaps a critical lens, and then using statistics, whether it's purposeful or not, but just an uncritical habit, just doing it, that are producing inequalities and inequities in education and other social settings.
Yes, using statistics to advance a white supremacist agenda is problematic. Using race for racial reasoning. So, for example, intelligence is due, your lack of intelligence is due to, is because of your race, or poverty is making causal claims and racial reasoning. We have to critique that, and we have to disrupt that. And so the interesting thing is scientific research is usually squared in the post-positivist and positivist paradigm, whereas espoused as objective, and that reality can be found and discovered, and there's values, and you can separate your values from what's observed, and that there is a discoverable truth, or at least we can come up with a probability of the truth. But if we consider the history of statistics, I argue that statistics was never objective, ever. It was always subjective, and there was always a clear agenda and purpose for statistics.
Yes, I mean, it's pretty, I think you just like laid it out there so plainly. I think too, even in bringing it back and thinking about your experiences as a person in K-12 or as a child, and then at university, and seeing kind of who also commands or has control of the method.
Narrative. Yes.
Right. And then it produces. And so I kind of see it as statistics are they may be numbers, but they're representations, right? They become reality if we're not critical of them.
Yes.
So well, kind of then, so with it just kind of summarized, and I guess too, it's critical quantitative research isn't so much about the methods, but how the methods are used, and also is coming with what questions are being asked as well.
Yeah, that's my perspective. Sure. But I think that there's other scholars who would go even deeper and challenge the methods. Like I think Tukufu Zuberi would challenge it. I mean, when I teach my statistics class, I problematize the bell curve. It was not intended to be used to describe people and how they fall. We don't fall in this normal distribution. There's an encyclopedia entry. I can't think of it right now. I'll see if it's in my resources. But I challenge some of the basic fundamental things that we're taught in our introductory statistics courses, and present counter narratives to it. And for me, it doesn't turn me away. It makes me engage even more. I want to understand what has been a tool to oppress. How can I disrupt if I don't understand what's running the engine? What's fueling it?
Well, thank you so much. I think, Kanisha, are you back on? Can't tell she's here, but I'm going to go to kind of our next question. So I'm thinking about it. Clearly, the approaches are. Well, I'm not going to say that. I'm just going to ask the question. So how does critical quantitative research then compare to critical qualitative research? Or, I mean, there's a clear, right? Numerical versus kind of interpretive, measurement versus interpretive paradigm. But how else, or what are some of the similarities? What are the differences?
I think that's a really good question, and I think I'm going to respond to it in this way. So at first glance, it may appear that these two methods are worlds apart. And I would argue differently. Qualitative methods are not immune from stereotyping, espousing racist or colonialist perspectives, or even trying to make causal claims based on socially constructed notions of race. So to me, how they compare is responsibility. We cannot situate the problem with the methods themselves and not question the users. So no matter what method you use, you have to interrogate and self-appraise your beliefs. We have to probe our research designs. We have to humanize the data. And we have to approach understanding the story behind the data, whether it's numbers, words, or art, with curiosity and humility. If we leave self unexamined, and we lack critical consciousness, we can all be guilty of perpetuating systems of marginalization and oppressing. This means qualitative research isn't exempt nor less culpable from my perspective.
So when it comes to doing these researches, right, because you're talking about with positionality, right? And there's been some in some of the critical quantitative literature about, like, kind of what you're talking about, centering yourself, having a position on, but you don't, again, and that's kind of maybe one of my critiques as well, is that whether it be quantitative or qualitative, like the importance of positionality and discussing that, and you don't see that in quantitative research.
And I don't think you're right. I don't see it. And I've been challenging myself because I've actually published and I haven't presented my positionality clearly. Like, I don't have a section. Here's my positionality. Here's where I'm situated in relation to the research. But I think that you could pick up on my philosophical assumptions. I try to make those clear in my research design. But I also don't see that a lot in qualitative research either. There's some that do a really good job, and there's some where it's completely missing as well. So I think that there's room for improvement in both sides. I do think you see it less often in quantitative, because I think it goes to more of that positivist leaning where it's like, okay, you need to keep self out of it. You know, the researchers, you need to keep a great distance between the researcher and what you're observing in the research. And for me, it's about, in quantitative, making transparent and eliminating that distance. I think that's a part of the work. And honestly, I'm still early in the stage, so I don't know how that's going to be received. And I may not always get it right, but that is my intent, and that is my approach.
Then so do you think, I mean, in terms of, is there a kind of have you noticed any trends in terms of that? Or is it, I mean, later research, right, coming out being more positionality focused, or is it just still kind of been the similar thing across, I guess, time and context?
I don't know. I think that I know that every qualitative study I read does not have a positionality statement.
Right.
They're not, and I also think that every qualitative study that I research, the philosophical assumptions are not even clear. And I would argue some have, to me, resemble a lot of positivist ways of thinking, even in qualitative research. So you can call it qualitative, but espouse different philosophical assumptions. And so I've yet to see a quantitative research study with the positionality statement either. So I think but that's just in my purview, what I've seen. It doesn't mean that it's not out there and researchers and scholars aren't doing it. I just haven't noticed it enough, or I haven't seen it enough to say that there's a trend.
Sure. Thank you very much. Kanisha? She's on and then back off. So we're having little struggles, but we'll keep rolling. No, that's the same thing with me. That's something I've really pushed back on, and I'm interested, especially when you're doing research in different contexts, and the importance of centering yourself. and being reflective and thinking about your positionality and subjectivity and how that all plays in. And so I find it problematic. I see why we may or may not, or what are even journal requirements or different things like that, but still positioning the self within research.
Yes, I would even say I first noticed it as a graduate student, and I went to a conference, and I was sitting in different it's very segregated. First of all, even when you talk about, if you go to sessions and they're more method, a lot, maybe quant methods, I rarely see scholars of color in those sessions. And then when you have the critical and the critical race theory, you see a lot of scholars of color. So I don't know why it's so racially and gender. It's very segregated. But when I went into these sessions, these quantitative sessions, rarely did I see a positionality statement. Rarely did I see a theoretical perspective. So to me, I think the theoretical perspectives were assumed to be in how they modeled the questions and the hypotheses that they presented. And so that's how, you really have to look at, okay, well, because it's not value, to me, it's not objective, it's not value free, but how are they making sense of these, how are they operationalizing it, making sense of these variables? What are the questions that they are asking? And really deconstructing the hypotheses and that are being made is one way you can get at it, even though maybe in qualitative, it's more common to say, okay, here, my study is framed through a critical race theory lens or through community cultural wealth, or, you may not see that in quant, but I feel like that's another approach of you kind of seeing the thinking, the behind the scenes thinking of a researcher in quant work.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, so kind of thinking about those same things, what advantages and challenges do critical quantitative research perspectives afford educational leadership scholars and practitioners?
I think one is impact. I think numbers have a huge impact. And if we can illustrate the impact of racism in numbers, that's powerful. Statistics can be a powerful way of articulating counter narratives and a powerful tool that can be used to resist oppression. Another one is you can scale, you can zoom out. It allows you to see trends, to see the picture from a wider lens. And for me, it's a really strong complement to qualitative research, because what quantitative can't do is we can't explain the cause. Even though we try to make these, we say, oh, this is an experimental design or quasi-experimental, and this is the cause. I personally don't think we can make those causal claims. That's my perspective. But I feel like we can explain what's going on. And I feel like qualitative is a good complement to go in and explain why, and to go dig deeper and go more in depth into the story. And so for, let's see. Also, another advantage I would say is perspective. I say once you begin to strengthen and develop your critical quant lens, I feel like we become less gullible to numbers thrown at us as truth, as in these causal claims and racial reasoning of differences. So, and while we can't do certain things and have certain initiatives within the communities that we serve, so we begin to question other research that we used to take at face value, and it empowers us to be able to challenge conclusions made. And for me, it's helped me to heal by looking back over my life and the things that were said about me and how I was quantified as a statistics. And it allows me to be able to push back and to see the larger structures and systems that were at play. I would say some opportunities or disadvantages, I call them opportunities, is how are we preparing our scholars to engage in critical quantitative work when I believe it's often taught through a white supremacist lens? The data sets that are presented, the examples used are breeding grounds for epistemic injustice. So I want to give the definition of epistemic injustice. It's the delegitimization of an individual or group as a credible knowledge source, or denial of a group to participate as knowledge producers based on prejudice. Where someone is wronged, specifically in their capacity as a knower. And I got that from Fricker, 2007. So those underrepresented in the academy, particularly scholars of color, might have similar experiences to my own, where the educational process and the content, it objectified me and my cultural community. The narrative shared about my cultural community were often ill understandings of my marginalized experience. Worse, I had the weighted responsibility and the urge to correct those narratives, only to have the counter narrative that I was presented denied as a legitimate knowledge source. So the false interpretations and the misleading arguments propagated through stats is seen as factual and remains unchecked. And Gilborn speaks a lot to this. So it discourages students of color and other members of underrepresented groups from engaging in the work. And so to feed off of that, I think that a lot of methods instructors are serving as gatekeepers and by discouraging students from studying certain populations, or even engaging in critical quantitative works in ways that is incongruent with hegemonic ways of knowing and doing. And so Gilborn spoke to this when he wrote, statistical work will be automatically privileged above qualitative research unless it dares to name racism, in which case it will be subject to the same dismissive attacks as any other anti-racist scholarship. I was like, when I read that, I'm like, wow. Yeah. Wow.
Right.
And then I think, oh, go ahead.
No.
And then I think the other thing is, so to me, that leads to the third one, which is accessibility. If we're not being properly trained, and if we are racially stratifying, even in higher ed and in these prep programs, you're making, I feel like non-statisticians are becoming intimidated by the numbers. We're less confident to, or we lack the confidence, or we don't have the expertise to challenge the conclusions or the methods that generated them. And that's problematic when you can put things out there and have these causal claims and it remains unchecked, because we can't speak to the numbers. We can't speak to how you got there, but obviously you got there. And so I think that that's a problem. And that's why I feel like we need to be at the table. We need to have a seat at the table.
So I just had a question from, there's a question posed online on the chat section. And I don't know if it's so much a question, but it's kind of this, but even in crit quant, aren't positivist epistemological assumptions still present?
Yes.
So then how would you address that, our work? I think you kind of touched on that already, but maybe just a little more explicit, like acknowledging, okay, these assumptions are here, but now what?
I think those assumptions are embedded in statistics. It was designed to be that way. It was designed, there was a clear agenda. But for me, when I engage in it, this is just my perspective, I approach it from a critical lens. And so, yes, it's imperfect. Like, I think I may make mistakes. But for me, I do it by the questions that I'm asking, by always situating the data within a larger historical and social context. I do it by my interpretations and also checking my own biases. It's my intentionality, it's my self-interrogation, and it's my humility when I'm approaching the data. To me, that is different from traditional approaches. So that's imperfect. And I know that, for example, a scholar that has really been vocal on this work, Tukufu Zuberi, would maybe even disagree with me and say, like, we need to go further. There's so many problems with regression and with the bell curve. I'm not there yet. For me, I feel like I am moving the needle by first even just asking questions and pushing back on some of the conclusions that are being made. For example, for me, I feel like I'm making a difference by even being in a room with people who think that they're doing social justice work just by disaggregating by race, a social construct, or making causal claims using race. For me, if no one's in the room to be able to challenge and to disrupt, we are complicit to me in perpetuating the status quo. So that's just where I am at this early stage in my career as a researcher, and I'm really interested in others' thoughts and perspectives. But that's just my take today.
Can change, I suppose, right? Day to day, or expand, right?
Well, I'm constantly growing. So hopefully my understanding and perspective today will continuously evolve. But that's my understanding and my passion as it stands today.
Excellent. So I'm going to move on. So we want to be, again, respectful of your time to our last question. What understandings are necessary for those who might be interested in engaging critical quantitative research? I think you made a really good point about the accessibility and how people are prepared, and talking about essentially the segregation within academia and who uses what approaches or methodologies. But what understandings, if viewers listening, are, what would you say to maybe a student who wants to do engage in critical quantitative research?
I would say with all research, I feel like the work begins with self-reflexivity is key. You have to be self-critical and relentlessly self-correcting. And so at the beginning of this conversation, I did not proclaim to have all of the answers, or to be like the knowledge holder. This is just my perspective, and I'm still learning and I'm still figuring it out. I'm actually through this process healing from the scars that I've had from the implications of quantitative research in my K-12 and higher education experience. So I would say that there is a need for more members of historically underrepresented groups, particularly students of color, to engage in critical quantitative inquiry. Social justice is not only difficult without members of these communities, but it's incomplete without our voice, our perspective, and our work. So my advice for members of marginalized communities is engage in this work is to remember that we are not tokens. We're not tokens. And our excellence is not abhorrent behavior of our cultural groups and lineage. For those viewing and questioning yourself, we are not imposters. I know that being in these spaces is not always easy, but being authentically you is necessary and is important in social justice work. We have a duty to take a seat at the table where our ancestors were previously denied. And we have to do so with the conviction of course correcting the injustices that still remain. So my advice would be to stay encouraged. Don't let anyone persuade you to pursue a different path. If you feel led to this work, and to know that this conversation is still, it's an ongoing conversation, and it's an ongoing conversation, and we all have different perspectives, and that's how we're just going to continue to grow.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much. Would you have any people, again, and also kind of follow up with that with people who are interested in this? I know that you had talked about this book, so when you said it, I was excited because I was staring right at it. The Thicker Than Blood: How Racial Statistics Lie by Tukufu Zuberi. I also, and I don't know, The White Logic, White Methods.
Yes, the edited book by Zuberi and I think Eduardo Bonilla Silva. Is that right?
Yes, that is correct. Do you have any other resources perhaps that would interest
I mentioned the encyclopedia entry about the history of the bell curve, and that's written by Fendler, Fendler, 2014. Gilborn has a lot of work. Gillborn, Gillborn. He has several articles, the Journal of Education Policy. I think that there's actually a special issue. Can't remember which journal, but there's actually a special issue of other folks doing critical quantitative work. And then, Stage and Wells, that's mostly rooted in higher education, and they had a special issue in New Directions. That's a good place also to go if you want to continue reading. But it's still, to me, it's an emerging approach with a lot of pushback. But also a lot of gaining interest in those who are saying, okay, we'll take that pushback and that critique, but how can we come to a resolve about this? Because we still need to be engaged.
Well, we greatly, we're just here, just a couple minutes left, but we just really greatly appreciate your insights and your perspective on critical quantitative research. I think it's, not seeing it in the ed leadership field or in ed leadership research. I think for people who have had similar experiences to yourself, and I can say probably for me and Kenesha as well, I think it's really to have kind of a tool for us to make sense of those experiences, make sense of what we experience in higher education settings, and the methodology courses that we take, but really to give us another way kind of to understand the world and the way that oppression works through even the research that tries to at times try to liberate or do to be unoppressive. But I think it's really important to have multiple perspectives and multiple approaches to kind of engaging critical scholarship. So just thank you so much for your time, your insights, your willingness to share ideas and additional resources. I can't thank you enough.
I thank you to Brandon and Kenesha for actually just starting this conversation and continuing this conversation. It feels really good to expand the network and to really be able to tackle those challenges and critiques together and opportunities together. So thank you so much for organizing this talk. I really appreciate it. Thank you for spending time with me this evening to have this conversation.
Thank you so much. So for viewers who are watching, be sure to tune in for the next AURA Division A Graduate Student Committee Connect series, which is tentatively scheduled for Monday, March 25th at 6 p.m. Thank you very much, Dr. Tabron.
Thank you. Have a good night.
Thank you, you too.